Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Mon. I'm your moderator for today. Welcome to today's session on hermeneutics in real life. And thank you for taking time out of your weekend to join us. The next conversation will be on Saturday in the new year, Saturday, January 8th at 2 p.m. US Eastern Time. And it'll be me speaking on the role of hermeneutics in my life as a civil servant. And I'll have more information on our website, which you all know is www.hinrl.org. Also on the site, we have a contact us link and where we welcome suggestions about the site and the project, and also suggestions for our future speakers. For today, we're so happy to have as our speaker, Marianne Moyaert, who will discuss with us how hermeneutics is relevant for, quote, critical interfaith pedagogy. Marianne is a professor of religion and theology at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. She is a prolific author, and among her work is the text In Response to the Religious Other, Recur and the Fragility of Interreligious Encounters in the Lexington Recur book series. So Marianne will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Participants, feel free to share your questions in the chat box. You can start typing your questions at any time during the presentation or after the presentation is concluded. If you want to raise a question, please use the chat box so we can provide a diverse group of questions. And please remember to mute your computers and cell phones. And please note that we will be recording this for future viewing on our website. So thank you, Marianne, and welcome.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, George, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and I see several names that I know and several faces that I haven't seen for such a long time. But it's really wonderful to see you all. So, as some of you know, I've worked a lot on Recur, and those who know the work of Recur will probably also hear him resound or resonate in the paper that I will be presenting here today, which is a paper on critical interfaith pedagogy. Since over a decade, and that's just to give a little bit of a context, and you have to know that every time when I teach in Amsterdam, the first question all my students have to answer is, d'où parlez-vous? Where do you speak from? So all of them have to start with that question, with which Recur also started his classes. And I've made it let's say that I try to model that also to my students by always doing that myself when I present a paper, thinking about how does the context in which I work or in which I think affect what I will be presenting here. So since over a decade, I've been working at a multi-faith faculty of religion and theology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And here I developed over the years an approach to interfaith learning, which revolves around the exchange of life stories. So my students are really, they're Buddhists, they're Muslims, they're Jews, Christians from various denominations, but they're also secular students. So the classroom is always mixed, okay? And so I developed an approach to interfaith learning, which revolves around the exchange of life stories. And this narrative pedagogy emphasizes how each person in the classroom is different in some way. Each student has his or her own religious biography, you could say. Next, this narrative approach to interfaith learning acknowledges that as embodied and embedded creatures, all human persons are somehow prejudiced. That is why raising self-awareness and engaging in critical self-reflection is so important. Finally, this narrative approach to interfaith learning also assumes that dialogue takes place or should take place in a safe space where students engage with one another in reciprocity and where they can co-create more nuanced knowledge. Learning with and from one another, students acquire appreciative knowledge about different faith traditions. They learn to recognize difference and sameness, and they gain the skills to constructively build relationships with people who believe and practice differently. And during the Q&A, I can also explain or elaborate a little bit more on this specific narrative approach to interfaith learning, should that be necessary. To this day, this narrative approach to interfaith learning occupies a central place in my education. Nevertheless, I also think it's important to complement this focus on interpersonal exchange with a more structural approach that challenges and unsettles normative thinking in the classroom. One problem with the narrative approach to interfaith learning, as I have experienced it and as I have developed it, is that it tends to overlook the fact that religious identity is also a social identity like gender or race or class, and that it impacts one's personal positionality within society. Certainly, it is true that people give meaning to their own identity, who one is, what one does, why one believes, and how one gives expression to one's beliefs in life. Nevertheless, it is also true that religious identities are socially constructed in a historical and cultural context marked by uneven power relations. Based on extant ideological normative assumptions, meaning and value are also ascribed to a person's religious identity in a manner that does not always necessarily overlap with his or her self-understanding. Let me further unpack this. First, whether this is recognized or not, any society projects an ideal of good, true, authentic, or what you could call normal religion. And any society harbors certain ideas about the proper place of religion within that society. And as a rule, furthermore, the projection of religious normalcy correlates with the construction and also the delegitimization of what falls outside the realm of religion, properly understood. In brief, quite often true religion, normal religion, good religion, authentic religion is placed over against deviant religion, which is religious abnormality. Second point, individuals are constantly socialized into society's norms vis-à-vis religion, until they internalize these norms and take them for granted. Individuals discriminate between people based on the distinction between religious normalcy on the one hand and religious deviation on the other hand. Many assumptions, many associations are so deeply embedded in the cultural archive of society that they also operate at an unconscious level. Think of the notion of implicit bias here. And these assumptions, they function between our ears and between our minds. My students, for example, they see statues of Hindu gods and they think idolatry or immature or pre-modern religion. And these are students that think of themselves as very open-minded. They see Buddhist meditation and they think enlightenment, spirituality, and peace. They see a niqab and they think oppression, traditionalism, and, importantly, non-European religion. The macro level of society's cultural archive, which has developed for centuries long, impacts the micro level of personal interaction. Finally, when the projection of religious normalcy goes together with significant power access to society's institutions, think here of the media, of school systems, of the government, the legal apparatus also, then the category of religion will contribute to the stratification of people. In fact, when the disadvantages and the benefits of adhering to one religious tradition are incorporated into the social fabric of society, then religious inequality becomes a real problem. Epistemologically, too, this leads to inequality. Indeed, those who deviate from the norm of what proper religion is may be placed in the position of having to explain themselves and their behavior, or even of having to defend themselves over against what is perceived to be the norm. If they want their perspective to be heard, they still have to relate to the norm, thereby at once reiterating this norm and reproducing it. And because they do not have the same access to institutional power, it's furthermore difficult to challenge the dominant worldview and change their societal position. Finally, deeply ingrained negative prejudicial stereotypes about religious minorities which deviate from the norm, tend to lead to a lowering of the credibility status of their voices. Miranda Fricker, for example, has done a lot of work explaining this. This further limits religious minorities' capacity to impact society's consensus about religious normalcy and to transform extant negative prejudices about their traditions. So consequently, while interfaith dialogue might be projected as a space of reciprocity, of co-formation, of co-creation, as educators, it's important to realize that it can also be experienced by those who deviate from the norm as a space of othering, where their identity is constantly problematized or exoticized and where they have to explain themselves constantly. So it's important to realize that what counts as religion and what doesn't count as religion changes over time. And these meaning shifts cannot be thought of apart from socio-political interests. Indeed, what we project as the religious normal today would not have been recognized as religious in the past. Furthermore, changing historical cultural assumptions about what religion is impact the way societies are organized and which policies are put in place to govern religion and religious diversity. These policies in turn affirm or reaffirm dominant ideological assumptions about religion and make them seem natural rather than constructed. In Europe, to make this a little bit more concrete, we recently have seen a paradigm shift from a passive tolerance model, which was based on the religious-secular divide, to an active dialogical pluralism model based on the so-called post-secular turn. And this post-secular paradigm consists of a whole set of ideas about religions that function as taken for granted assumptions. And the general trust is first that religion has made a comeback, but it has made a comeback as a problem and as a security issue. The distinction between the so-called two faces of faith further shapes the way many European countries manage religion and religious diversity. Underpinning the face of good religion are various liberal assumptions about what religion is and should be, and what its proper place in society is. Good religion is reasonable. It does not cling to the material. It's not too visible. It's not too palpable. It's not too smellable. It does not cling to ritual or legal dimensions of religion. It accepts critique. It strives for detachment. Good religion does not need outer show, and it views those ritual, material, spatial externalities as historical, culturally determined, and hence as relative. It's of secondary importance to what is really important to religion. Authentic religiosity, or mature faith, is spiritual. It's apolitical. It's personal rather than ritual, material, political, or traditional. These liberal assumptions intersect with the imaginary of Protestantism as the cradle of enlightened tolerance, and the religious-secular divide as the guarantee of civic peace in plural societies. Starting from these assumptions, policy measures are put in place to restore the good face of a faith, to restore the benevolent forms of religion, and to counteract dangerous or problematic expressions of faith and religion. Those who claim to adhere to a form of good religion are expected to seek, to combat, and to reform bad religion. The promotion of interfaith education and interfaith collaboration in Europe is part of this paradigm shift. So we see a lot of European policy documents that really promote interfaith learning in the classroom as a way to promote good religion and to counteract bad religion. The projection of good religion goes hand in hand with the construction of bad religion. And we see that throughout history. But what good religion is and what bad religion is, that changes and that shifts. Within the post-secular frame, bad religion is dangerous and political, it's extremist, it's fundamentalist, it's too orthodox, not enlightened, not emancipated, too attached to a literal reading of scripture, too observant when it comes to ritual practice, too conservative when it comes to religious law, and so forth. In Europe, especially, Islamic communities have been cast as potentially dangerous and in need of constant surveillance. While it is seen as the utmost importance to discern between good Muslims and bad Muslims, since 9/11, Muslims overall have been mistrusted. Importantly, however, the negative stereotypes that circulate about Muslims, they are not new at all, but they rather reiterate age-old pejorative images that have been accumulating for centuries long and that are now being put to use in a new context. The rapprochement of Islam, furthermore, also justifies policies that are intent on containing, domesticating, and even eradicating bad religion. Just 3 weeks ago, for example, in the Netherlands, we had a whole scandal where it seemed that without their knowing, mosques in the Netherlands, mosques where there was no problem at all, have been surveilled by the government with no legal framework for that. Let me return to my classroom. One of the reasons why it's extra difficult to uncover the play of legitimization and delegitimization, the play between good and bad religion, is the fact that the very idea of religious stratification does not match with most dialoguers' sense of self, especially those who belong to the majority. Not only is it likely that dialoguers, people who are engaged out of intention, good intention in interfaith learning, it's likely that dialoguers will consider their liberal democratic society as one which, contrary to many societies, has laws that protect against religious discrimination. Laws that, moreover, are the outcome precisely of modern enlightenment and the religio-secular divide. Many, furthermore, will consider religion as a private affair and a personal choice. A liberal society, at least that seems to be the assumption, protects this choice, allows individuals the freedom to pursue their existing religion, to also question their religion, to abandon their religion, or to share it with others. But it is a freedom of choice. This acclaimed innocence makes it more difficult to recognize and to take responsibility for contemporary expressions of religious stratification. To add to this problem, those who are drawn to interfaith learning tend to self-identify as good people. They are good people who are concerned about the polarization in society, in our pluralizing societies. They recognize the problem of religious exclusivism, and they believe in any case that people who orient around religion differently, they ought to collaborate more. And usually they tend to see themselves as open-minded, and they position themselves beyond triumphalist and hegemonic patterns of thinking, characteristic of a past that they have rejected and they have transcended. Besides, the dialogical turn is projected as a deliberate break with the past, and this makes it extra hard to reflect on the way they are continuing this past themselves. The past of triumphalism, they think, is overcome in the dialogue. And this self-image may lead dialoguers who belong to the majority and hence are not affected by religious marginalization to claim a certain innocence, which may conceal an active ignorance on how their own discourses step into ideological assumptions about religion and religious diversity. To the degree that dialoguers are convinced that they have already arrived where they have to be, they would much rather invest their energy in ensuring that others likewise embrace dialogical values of openness and humility and hospitality than in critical examination of how they are legators and continuators of a history of religious stratification. And because of the power imbalance in the dialogical space, which can be reinforced by a sense of dialogical innocence, an exchange of personal micro-stories will simply not suffice to do justice to the discrepant experiences of those who embody the norm and those who deviate from this norm. In the past couple of years, I've come to complement the narrative approach to interfaith learning with a critical longue durée approach, which explores the social construction of religious normalcy over against religious deviance at key moments throughout European history. This approach is a very historical approach. It helps me to instill my students with a sense of historical and political consciousness. So I try to show that in every phase of history, we see that there's a different conception of what is the religious norm and what is religious deviation. And I try to also show them how policy measures have been implemented to govern good and bad religion. And by showing in each stage of history how this works out, I try to instill them with this historical and this political consciousness and to move them towards the understanding that also in our time, in our very liberal time, this is what we do, so that we can at least open up that discussion. So part of this critical interfaith pedagogy is the joint exploration of the historical, culturally determined construction of religious normalcy. So together with my students, we examine how the norm has changed throughout history, how that impacted the construction also of religious deviation. Next, we look into different policies to govern religion throughout history. And finally, we consider how some of the past assumptions that have been projected onto others continue to impact us today in ways that we might be unaware of. Here, the emphasis does not lie on exchanging personal stories, but rather on trying to understand how throughout history, structures of religious inequality have been put in place, until my students, especially those who belong to the majority, are a little bit less certain about their own innocence. And until a hermeneutical space opens up, in which they are ready to consider the possibility that their proper generation too establishes problematic systems of differentiation. So the learning objectives of this critical historical approach are making insightful how the negotiation of the conceptual boundaries of religious normalcy goes hand in hand with the process of drawing boundaries around non-religion or false religion, bad religion, problematic religion. To be able to grasp how religious stratification throughout history functions, namely that those who have the power to define what true religion is, what the norm is going to be, also have the power to discredit, marginalize, and govern those who are singled out as adhering to false or deviant religion. To see how collective negative stereotypes about religious minorities build up over time until they become part of society's cultural archive, and how those in power at various historical moments and depending on their interests at the moment, made use of this cultural archive to create images of otherness that serve them well. To be able to understand the presence of the past and answer the question, where does our current understanding of religious normalcy come from, as well as our image of religious deviation? This critical approach to interfaith pedagogy provides my students with the analytical tools to ask to what extent religious othering continues to happen today, how they themselves are part of this problem, and how they may be part of the solution. After all, the starting point of the transformation of inequality is developing an awareness of oppressive social structures. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I'd like to open it up for questions. Victor, I see a question from Victor. Victor, would you like to speak to your question?
Yes, of course. Marianne, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And I said that I wrote that I really appreciated the fact that you started by asking yourself where you are coming from, or you are teaching that to your students. And I will start using that myself as well. Contextualizing your points of view is so important. And then I want to link that to my question. I know you have given a wonderful explanation as to what you're doing at a theoretical level, but when it comes to dialoguing, say on the street, how can we ensure that a true dialogue takes place when we all want implicitly to make a point and win the other over? And what do we do when disagreements arise? I mean, that's unfortunately the case in throughout history. Even within the Reformed tradition in the Netherlands, you have all these splits within churches. But also I am thinking, say, Richard Dawkins, and as an atheist, advocating for his point of view, and that's in a European context, and we don't. And so, how can we ensure that we are not talking each other and not really reaching any agreement? But is it really necessary to reach an agreement? And if we disagree, what do we do with that? When it comes to faith, I mean, emotions take over, and we all have implicitly, as I said, a kind of a goal. So how do you see the situation?
Mm-hmm. And there's many questions there, Victor. It's more than one. So as to dialogue on the streets, I don't know. But I can tell you a little bit more about how we do it in my classroom and in the Interfaith Leadership program that I've been running for a couple of years now. So what you speak to is the difference between dialogue and debate. So one of the first things that we do in our classroom is immediately give agency to the students themselves and ask them the question, what's the difference between dialogue and debate? How do you listen differently when you dialogue, and how do you listen when you debate? And so it's the first exercise I always do with the students. And so what they will say is, in dialogue, you listen to understand the other better. In debate, you listen to win your point. And so they make a whole list of the distinction between dialogue and debate. So that's the first exercise. And I explain them very clearly that what we do in the classroom is not debate. I'm not saying that there's no place for debate. Debate is an interesting form of conversation, and in certain settings, it might be a good thing to have a debate. But that's not what we do in my classroom. In my classroom, we do dialogue. And so then they set together the rules for dialogue. How are we going to have a conversation together so that we do not lapse back into debate, which we sometimes do. I do that. I mean, when I go to a meeting, sometimes I just listen to score my point because I want to win this. It's not very conducive in the long term, but we tend to lapse into it. Yeah? And so they make all sorts of rules of how they will have a conversation together. And that's like their social contract. So I don't tell them what to do. They have to come up with it together. And we'll bring those rules each time again to the classroom, and people can say, hey, Victor, that's not dialogue, yeah, or this is not what we agreed on. Or you might want to say, would like to add a rule, which is something important, which I realized. So that's already two things that I would want to say. The goal of dialogue is never to agree with one another. Sometimes you reach consensus, but sometimes you just come to the situation where you say, well, I understand what you're saying, but I do not share your point of view. You can't share everyone's point of view. Yeah? That's just not doable. Sometimes you learn to see, well, this is a complex problem and we have to approach it from different perspectives because it's multi-layered. So there's all sorts of outcomes of a dialogue. There's one approach which I really appreciate and which I also implement in the classroom of interreligious hermeneutics. So we always bring together, it's very Ricoeurian at George, we bring together theory and practice all of the time because I don't believe that you can learn what the dialogical self is if you do not model dialogue. And so they learn the interwovenness of the stories of lives, the fact that there are dimensions of your life that have been given to you, but also those that you take charge of. They learn to see sameness and difference through dialoguing. So I actually implement also a lot of practices of conversation, and one of them is scriptural reasoning, which I like. Some of my students are very text-based. They're Reformed students or Muslim students or Jewish students are very text-based. So you have to find a form of dialogue that's very respectful also for their identity. Do you understand? And so scriptural reasoning is that Jews, Muslims, Christians reading their scriptures together. And the goal thereof is never to find agreement, but to learn to disagree better.
Okay.
Which I really like a lot. Yeah. So I think yeah. And so with regard to the emotions, perhaps that's one of the things that I like so much about Ricoeur, the idea that that's also a framework I always explain to students. We're not just minds, we're mind-embodied or embodied minds. And so we also listen not only with our mind, but with our entire body and also with our emotional, with our emotions also. So I teach the students to listen to one another, not just, some students will have to listen. So these are exercises. They listen to facts. Yeah, so someone explains something, you have to listen, Victor, to the facts. George, you're going to listen to the values. And Molly, you're going to listen to the emotions. What's happening here. Yeah, so they learn to also take that emotional field with them in the classroom. And once you are much more aware, I mean, it's a bit like what Ricoeur says, if your starting point is, I don't have any prejudices, that's when the problem begins. Yeah, but if you start from the assumption that you are prejudiced, we're all prejudiced, then you can start also, okay, exploring what are the biases or the prejudices that you bring to the table. And it's similar, if you think you only listen with your mind as a very rational being, then you give your emotions complete free play. But if you also check in with your emotions, then you can also give them the space to get a constructive space. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Thank you very much for your brilliant answers. And I will like to stay in touch. I'll write to you. And I don't know whether you have published something on the difference between debate and dialogue. And
no, but I can. That's not original. But I can just give you what you can read. That's I'm not taking credit for that.
I like that point. I like your answer. Thank you very much.
I think Jay's question is sort of an extension of this discussion. Jay, did you want to speak to your comment, I guess?
It's a bit long, but I guess my point is rather simple, and that is, when it's us, the good religion, and the other, the bad religion, it sort of assumes a unified us. And it seems to me that that's the real dynamic that's motivating, is there is no pure understanding of each other within a collective. There's dissension, there's tension, and the other becomes a way to paper over the other within us, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if you experience that in your class, that oftentimes students' views externally are really speaking as much to the issues of internal beliefs. And just to give an example, even a very hierarchical religion like Catholicism has a huge gamut of beliefs and commitments. And I put from Opus Dei to Dorothy Day, that's a pretty long road to travel. So do we look to the other to pretend like we ourselves are not embodying an otherness?
Yeah, Jay, I can only completely agree with that. So if it's been a while, of course, but when I wrote the book in response to the religious other on the fragility of interfaith encounters, very much that was the framework where when you place us and them in some kind of a dichotomy or in a binary, it's quite often to cover up, does that make sense? To cover up the vulnerability within yourself. And for me, fragility, vulnerability, that those are, it points to the fact that you're never completely at home in your own identity. I don't know if I explained this properly, but that's what Ricoeur actually wants to say, that your entire identity, if he speaks about oneself as another, the way I've understood it at least, and I'm amongst all of these Ricoeurians, but the way I've understood it at least is that your whole entire identity is permeated by structures of otherness. And And it's precisely because there's these fissures within your own identity that you need also the detour via the other to make sense of your own identity. Yeah. And so this vulnerability is in a way a good thing, because vulnerability is interconnected with reciprocity. If you would be completely at home with yourself, completely, sometimes I say to my students, at ease also with yourself, there's no need to go outside. Yeah. But it's precisely because there's this fissure, because you're permeated by different elements of otherness, and you need to go out and via the detour of others to make sense of yourself. But I also say it's not always pleasant. It's not always pleasant, because that fissure is a real vulnerability, and rejection from others, certainly others that matter to you, can actually hurt. So you have to do it in a way that is somehow safe enough to also carry or bear or tolerate the fact that you're sometimes pointed at your fragility. Does that make sense? So if it's too vulnerable, if a dialogical space can't guarantee a certain safeness or a certain safety, then people will either start defending themselves or lashing out or not listening anymore. So you have to find a balance between, vulnerability in a good way and harm that is also possible. Don't know whether that's an answer to your question, Jacob.
Yes, thank you very much. And also, I suppose toleration is could be the ultimate protective device, right? I'm overcoming my own fragility by believing that I can tolerate this other and not be unsettled, rather than an open spirit. Or I guess I would be concerned about that potential.
Can you explain a bit? Do you see toleration as the ultimate goal, or because I didn't quite understand you? Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have followed up their other questions, but I suppose we think of toleration as coming from a position of strength. We feel secure in our religion and can tolerate others, but often I wonder if it's really just tapping into that fragility again, that the act of toleration is trying to say, this fragility we have is not destructive. We can survive it.
Yeah, I think it depends for me always when we speak about toleration and the question whether that's a good thing or not. For me, that very much depends on in what context and in what situation. When a society says to religious minorities, we tolerate you, I see that as rather problematic, in the sense that it's a defense mechanism. Basically, you're saying, well, we're tolerating you as long as you don't try to change us too much, as long as you're not impacting our society too much, and we'll make sure that our institutions are such that you really are not capable of making too much of a change. Toleration looks very differently from depending on whether you're the one in power to tolerate others or whether you're the subject of toleration. That's one dimension of it. But in an individual relations, sometimes toleration is the best you can do. Sometimes at a certain moment in time, you just have to say, well, I don't understand this, I don't appreciate it, but I'm going to tolerate it. Might look differently later onwards, but that's then more in a one-on-one relationship, I think. Yeah.
John, is your question related to this thread?
I don't know. I'm probably close to it.
Okay, yeah, and then so I'll let you go, and then Joseph will come to you if that's okay.
Sure.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, so that was wonderful, Marianne. I'm so I really want to share this with my graduate students, but the question I wanted to ask you was about, you used the term systems of differentiation, and I'm wondering if there should also be a materialist dimension of this critique, because this theme that you develop of the blindness of innocence that's hidden in our norms, right, in this sort of liberal mode, that's so wonderfully set up for you. But what about, so I'm thinking in terms of, say, for example, Jay's example of the Catholic Church in the United States, with the voice of sisters who are often on some topics more progressive, right? But the question is who gets to sit at the table and where do you sit at the table, right? So these more institutional, structural impediments to equal say, equal chance to speak to power. So I'm wondering if that also has a place in this mode of criticism.
Yeah. So what I try to do is I'm currently, it's a little bit of a project that got out of hand, but so what I'm currently writing a book on what I call patterns of religionization. And so that's really about the way Christians, and I speak from a European perspective. So other people in their context have to do their work, but I speak very much from a European perspective. And so I look at the way Christians throughout history, both in Europe and in the colonies, have named, classified, essentialized, and governed people who deviate from the religious norm. Yeah, so that's a little bit what I try to do. And there's a whole discursive level to that. Yeah, so really how the image of the other has been made, has been produced, has been created throughout history. And we've had many others. We've had pagans, we've had Jews, we've had Muslims, we've had Pagano Catholics, for example, we've had heretics. There's been so many different others depending on the time and the stage and so on and so forth. But by implementing also the level of governments, you really also say, well, you have to look at the way these images of otherness and normalcy have been implemented and institutionalized in societies. And that's really a question of power. Who gets to sit at the table, for example? Who gets to do this job? Sometimes it's very simple. Who gets to do this job and who is not allowed to do this job? Who gets to erect his or her religious house here, or does it have to be placed somewhere else? With whom can you marry or have a relationship, or and so on and so forth? And you can say, well, that's all from the past, but it's not from the past. And perhaps in your context, I don't know, but in Europe, for example, we still have a lot of rules that are now clothed, can you say that like that, as protecting religious normalcy, protecting the public space, and so on and so forth, but they really stratify people. For example, if you wear a headscarf, you are not allowed to be part of public office. Yeah, you're not allowed to teach in primary school or in secondary school if you wear a headscarf. Many shops will say you're not allowed to work here if you wear a headscarf. That's very much limiting what you're allowed to do. And this is just one example. There's many other examples that I could give. So there's a discursive level, but there's very much also an institutionalized level. And that institutionalized level, that's about laws. It's interesting to look at different laws, and laws are interesting because no society ever completely changes his or her laws. Yeah, I mean, you build up, you change laws, you invent new ones, and so on and so forth. But quite often there's a long continuation. And next to laws, of course, there's the material dimension. And with the material dimension, I also mean the spatial dimension, the architectural dimension, the ritual dimension, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to look at. Yeah.
Joseph, I wondered if you wanted to speak to your.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your work, Marianne. I'm very excited by it. You mentioned social construction as an essential part of how you put the dialogue out into the classroom. Mm-hmm. And I'm worried about social construction because it continues to move and change in a way that, for instance, the social construction of the Dutch West Indies Company and Peter Stuyvesant and the first 23 Jews that came from Recife to New Amsterdam was not the social construction that now makes Amsterdam the Shoah capital of Western Europe with the Anne Frank House. And Dana Horn's new idiom of the world now embracing dead Jews. It's easier for that world. And because social construction often conflates Jews, Jewish life, Judaism, and Zionism, which then makes the question of Jews in your class needing to defend Israeli policy. That's a social construction product. What happens in Gaza, Jews have to answer for. And what do you do with a social construction that conflates such complexity? Because the pluralism I learned from David Tracy allows for ambiguity and complexity. But often social construction demands a conflated binary reality.
Well, I can only speak to how I understand the idea of a social constructed identity. And that's probably a way too simplistic understanding, but what I try to say is that there's a tendency in emphasizing very much how we are owners of our own biography. We write our own life story. It's our personal biography. We are the authors of our own life. Yeah? And what I try to explain to our students is that, well, true as that may be, true as it may be that any student in my classroom tries to make sense of what it means for them to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim and so on and so forth. And that exchange of stories is really important. It's also, it allows them to connect and to interconnect. Yeah, so that's why I said earlier, the critical approach, I'm always going to complement that with that more interpersonal approach. Yeah, because else you run the risk, we can speak about that a little bit more in a moment. If you do not complement them, in my experience, it becomes kind of an, how do you say that? An opposite, who's marginalized most, something like that. I don't mean that, yeah, like you did, I'm marginalized, no, I'm marginalized more, I'm more, yeah. So so you need the exchange of personal narratives to also have the connection. Yeah. What I mean with social construction for me is that before even you start making sense of your own life, thinking about the direction of your life and so on and so forth, meaning and value has already been attributed to your identity based on the group to which you belong. Yeah. For example, I'm a Catholic working at a former Reformed Protestant theological department. I'm most often the only Catholic there. Yeah. Even when I enter the classroom, there's already a lot of meaning and meaning projected onto my identity, which does not necessarily match to the way I try to make sense of my Catholic identity, but it is already projected. Yeah, similar to Muslim students or Jewish students or Christian students. When those extant normative assumptions, yeah, that circulate in a society are part of the dominant cultural archive, and what do I mean by that? They are constantly reiterated in the media, in education, via laws, and so on and so forth. Yeah, then you get kind of a power imbalance. Yeah, so there's all sorts of normative assumptions circulated and projected onto identities, but not all of them carry the same weight. Yeah. And so what I do try to do in my classroom is to make students aware of that. Where do our assumptions come from? What do we project onto others? And where do those projections come from? What's the history thereof? Okay. So for me, thinking in terms of social construction is not contrary to thinking in terms of ambivalence and ambiguity. I don't see the contradiction, to be honest. Yeah, I don't necessarily see the contradiction. As to the meeting between my students and, for example, the entering into my classroom of what happens in Israel and in Gaza, what I often do there is, when that happens, take a step back and say, we do not hold people responsible here for what is happening somewhere else. You should not assume that because someone is Muslim or Jewish, that they necessarily support the politics over there. Yeah? There are always gradations of loyalties and of commitments, and one should not one-on-one assume that because one is Jewish, that one is a supporter of the current politics of Israel, or that, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Immediately, I will link that also precisely with that idea that there are normative assumptions circulating in society. You're a Jew, you're this. You're a Muslim, you must be anti-Semite. You're a Christian, you're probably a supporter, well, depending on the country, of course, you will be a supporter of Palestine, or you'll be a supporter of Zionism, or those kind of assumptions will deconstruct them. And then next, what I do when that comes in, because it sometimes happens, last year in May, it was terrible. Take a step back, make very clear that we're in the here and now. Yeah. Over there, they can't fix it. So we're certainly not going to fix it either. Yeah. But let's take a step back and ask one another, how does it affect you? What does it do with you? Yeah. How, and then again, those personal narratives for a moment. Yeah. To reconnect again. Does that make sense?
Very much. And I very much now better understand how the social construction is a necessary part of the foundation. Your answer was caring and collective. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because it is also the case that there's a lot of pushback against the understanding of religion as a social construct. And knowing my students and caring much about them, I understand that. I understand why they don't like the idea of their religious identity being a social construct. But if you carefully explain what you mean by it, yeah, you get a whole way further. Yeah? If you understand social construct as saying, well, it's all imaginary, well, there's something to be said about that, but then you have to explain what you mean by imaginary. Yeah? And so that's the power of education. And if you take your time and you do not just barge in, students are very open to learn, to understand what's going on.
We have a few minutes left, but I see Mariah, it's just popped up with a question. Would you like to share?
Thank you. And if this isn't the time or space, I can email you, Marianne.
Okay.
So
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes.
I was wondering if you have any suggestions on what a faith-based institution, higher ed institution, could do when they begin to open up their institution to multi-faiths for the first time. Are there any maybe practical suggestions that you have? This is obviously a specific question to me. So if this is not the space, that's fine.
Oh, but do you mean open up for students of other?
Yeah, sorry,
or
to
staff,
accept
or?
students, yeah.
Well, I think that there's a lot of work to be done then. By all likelihood, you will have a majority minority situation. You will have some students that deviate from whatever the norm is in your institution, and by all likelihood it will be Christian. I'm assuming, and a certain kind of Christian. So I think it would be important for the staff to consider this, and to have a conversation of how are we going to accommodate these students. Because if you're only going to use literature that is from a Christian background, or refer to role models, or all your staff is Christian, and so on and so forth, and your whole calendar is Christian, and the whole structure of your institution is Christian, then there might not be so much space for those of other faiths to actually contribute to the classroom. So it's at least good to have that conversation. Then it's a really good idea, but this is very basic, to consider who will these students be and what are their needs. Think of it from the perspective of a diversity officer. We have learned to accommodate issues concerning gender and disability, for example. We also have to learn to think about, okay, what are the needs of students of different faith traditions when they come to our institution. For example, we don't teach on Friday. We have no exams on Saturday. It's not that the students have to ask not to have exams on Saturday, because then each time they have to come in. We're done with it. We don't serve alcohol, which I think for all sorts of non-religious reasons is a really good idea. I don't see why you should serve alcohol in a professional context, but that's my opinion. So for me, it's not so difficult. But we no longer do that. It's not so difficult. We have halal and kosher food. We have vegan food. We have vegetarian food. We have a space where people can pray. We make sure that there's time for them to pray, and it's not in the basement. Please do not put them in the basement where there's no light. We look at the calendar and we see when are the feasts, and we make sure that someone thinks of the fact that perhaps it's nice to send it around, that there's a feast coming up, and so sometimes it's also smaller things. We had to learn, and we are still learning, and it's still difficult because I don't want to make it into a very it's not easy. It's much easier to just teach Catholic students. It's not so exciting, perhaps, or exciting in a different way, but it's not easy because you'll make mistakes. Your language is completely immersed by your culture. In that sense, the 19th century philologists, they kind of had a point. The idea that language is expressive of your culture, what you say, how you say it, the words you use, they say a lot about what you value, and you have to learn to adapt your language. And that's a long, long process. And my experience is that what is difficult is to find the right balance between acknowledging that there's going to be systemic prejudices in the sense that it's just everywhere. It's in your institutions, it's in your language, it's in your culture, it's in the way the structure of your year, and so on and so forth. Acknowledging that, looking into that, and making sure that you do not start blaming persons personally. Does that make sense? That we will to continue to create a space in which you hold people responsible, you create a space in which people are willing to do the work they have to do, but without all of the time blaming people for the mistakes they also make, to find the balance there. Does that make sense? That's a challenge.
I see there are still questions and comments coming up. Oh, there's just a thank you. I'm sorry, Michael, we didn't get to your comment and question. Perhaps you and Marianne can exchange later. But I just want to thank you, Marianne, for your presentation. Obviously, the lively discussion that ensued. This was wonderful, and thanks again, everyone. And see you in the new year.
Can I really quickly ask a question to the Ricoeur scholars here? Could I? I've been pondering about. So I've read Ricoeur very much in terms of really interesting to develop this narrative approach to interfaith learning, very much as this interpersonal exchange. And the way I've read him is that there's possibilities to think about power imbalances, but he didn't say too much about that in terms of social constructivism and majority and minority, but I'm not sure. So does that make sense? So the way I've read him is and his relationship between oneself as the idea of oneself as another, like I have my biography, I have my story to tell, and the interwovenness of stories and the exchange. It's very conducive of this very personal approach to interfaith learning. And that idea that we're all prejudiced, we're all biased, we all have our background and so on and so forth. It's very much, we're all different. But am I missing something in his work that would also open up the space to think through that power imbalance? I don't know whether my question is clear though.
One thing, Marianne, his Ricoeur's work in ideology might be useful, and I think some of his reflections in terms of Habermas to offer some thoughts. But the ideology work, and I would agree, is not so much specific on power, but there is a Marxian thread that he does pursue that I think would be relevant for that question. It's a very important question. I thought that was one of the very powerful aspects of your presentation to bring out that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
And David's not here anymore.
Oh.
I'm thinking also the earlier essays, before the narrative turn, in the political essays, where he talks much more from a sort of more of the Marxist end of things.
Yeah. So his lectures on ideology and utopia, you would say, probably.
But then the early essays and lectures in the late 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Because I know there have been colleagues, but I haven't read everything, but that there's been colleagues that have also looked at gender in relation to Ricoeur. I would think they would have explored this too, no?
Yeah, that's interesting because Annemie has been writing on gender. I'm not sure how much she's been talking in terms of power, but she might be someone to interact with on that.
Yeah, okay.
I believe in the course of recognition, he's examined some of these issues.
Okay. I don't want to, yeah, sorry.
Could I just toss something into the ring too, since we're all tossing things into the ring here? I think, you might also want to just sort of look back at some of the essays where he talks about the Gadamer-Habermas debate.
Yeah, okay.
Because, in fact, as you were speaking, and I really very much appreciated what you said, it reminded me a little bit of that. I recall Gadamer at some point said, what we haven't had yet is we haven't yet embarked on the dialogue of the great religions of the world. And I don't remember where he said that. And it struck me that in some senses, the initiative that you're taking here is very much sort of part of that, sort of engaging in that dialogue, perhaps on a more personal level. But the other thing that I would just mention is that when Ricoeur puts Gadamer and Habermas in the debate, he doesn't just, it's no longer just I mean, the terms of the debate, in a sense, of the terms of the dialectic change, because to take two positions and put them in a dialectic, the terms change. So in Gadamer, then he talks about an ontology of prior understanding, but the critical side is just no longer the critique of ideology. It becomes an eschatology of nonviolence, and so I mean, in a sense, in terms of the sort of the horizon, if you will, of interfaith dialogue, it might be interesting to think about it in terms of that sort of eschatological moment.
Mhm. Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. I don't want to do injustice to Recur, so I thought I'll just pick your brains a little bit.
You might also look at David Tracy's new book, Fragments. David has an excellent essay on Ricoeur as a religious philosopher. And they taught together at the Divinity School.
Yes, I know. Okay,
So
thanks. All right, thank you.